For example, during this intersectional work between the last COP and the next COP, it was also decided that the subsidiary body of the Basel Convention, the open-ended working group 10, should look further to improve these guidelines and also consider a few other issues which were highlighted by the parties that still needed to be discussed and further elaborated, such as the issue of residual lifetime and age of used equipment, the management of hazardous waste from failure analysis, repair, and refurbishment operations, specifically in developing countries, the issue of obsolete technologies, including CRTs, cathodes, ray tubes, and the presence of hazardous components in used equipment. Also, in this decision, it was requested that parties and other stakeholders provide comments on the use of the technical guidelines and on these issues that I just mentioned in the point above. So the Secretary should receive information about different positions and different input regarding these areas. And part of this information should be put on the website, and part of this information should feed the work of the small intersessional working group that works on the technical guidelines, so that they can further elaborate these guidelines. The guidelines offer guidance on different areas, for example, on the distinction between waste and non-waste, also on the transboundary movement of electronic waste. There is also information on enforcement of provisions regarding transboundary movements of e-waste and used equipment, and the distinction between hazardous and non-hazardous waste, as well as guidance on facilities that conduct failure analysis, repair, and refurbishment. Just recall a little bit what the scope of the convention is related to here. So the convention defines waste as substances or objects which are disposed of or are intended to be disposed of or are required to be disposed of by the provisions of national law. So it's very clear that the focus of the convention is in the case of waste, specifically on hazardous waste. And inside of the convention text, we have two provisions which define hazardous waste. One is Article 1, Paragraph A, which says that waste that belong to any category contained in Annex 1, unless they do not possess hazardous characteristics listed in Annex 3, should be considered hazardous waste. And the other provision for the definition of hazardous waste according to the Basel Convention is Article 1, B, 11B, which says that wastes that are not covered under Paragraph 1A, but are defined as or considered to be hazardous wastes by the national law on domestic legislation of the party of import, export, or transit can also be considered hazardous waste. This means that a party can follow the previous definition, the definition under Article 11A, but can also extend the definition and include other wastes as hazardous waste. And that will really determine the type of export, import, and transit situations where a country can be in. In the scope of the guidelines, the used equipment is waste in a country if it's defined or considered to be waste under the provisions of that country's national legislation. Used equipment should normally be considered waste if, for example, the equipment is destined for disposal or recycling instead of reuse or failure analysis. If the equipment is not functional, if it's not packaged properly so that it can be damaged during the transport, if the equipment has among its constituent parts hazardous components, and there are more items in the guidelines. There are about 10 items listed under Paragraph 30, which help parties understand and define what used equipment should be, when used equipment should normally be considered waste. And then if that's the case, the Basel conditions apply, the PIC procedure apply. Then the interesting part of these guidelines is exactly when we start discussing when used equipment should not be considered waste. And the guidelines show two possibilities, which are very difficult for parties and others to have full agreement. So one possibility here is that equipment is destined for direct reuse or extended use by the original owner. In this case, the used equipment then is not considered waste. Another possibility is that the equipment is destined for failure analysis, repair, and refurbishment. In that case, again, used equipment could possibly not be considered waste, but then used equipment only. And again, we have a lot of more details in the guidelines, which gives us more specific information on this area. The paragraph 31A and B. So for example, here on the screen, what you can see is a summary of what's related to paragraph 31A, which is focused on the situation when equipment is destined for direct reuse or extended use by the original owner, and not destined for recovery, recycling, or final disposal. So in this case, if a transboundary movement of such equipment is supposed to happen, some documents should accompany the shipments. For example, a copy of the invoice or the contract relating to the sale or transfer of ownership of the used equipment. Also, evidence of evaluation or testing. So this you can also find in paragraph 31A. Additionally, there should be accompanying the equipment a declaration made by the person who is arranging the transport that none of this equipment is considered to be waste in any of the countries involved in the transport, meaning countries of export, import, or, if applicable, countries of transit. And there are more. There are more details. So, for example, also that each piece of equipment should be individually protected against damage to prevent hazards during the transportation or packaging or stacking of the load. In paragraph 31B, which is the other case when used equipment should not be considered waste, the focus here is when this used equipment is destined for failure analysis, repair, or refurbishment. So the intention here is that this equipment is going to be repaired and eventually is going to be reused again. And in this case, also documentation is required as per the technical guidelines. For example, a contract which shows that exists an agreement between the person who is arranging the transport and the legal representative of the facility where this equipment is going to be repaired, refurbished, or undergo failure analysis. And the guidelines extends it and has more documentation that should accompany in this case. For example, under paragraph 32, it says that you should have also the name of the person arranging the transport, so that it's very easy to identify. In case there is an issue during the transportation, you should really have a responsible person that someone can contact and understand what the problem is and maybe find a solution. You also need to include description of the transport and the equipment that is being transported and the quantity, etc. A declaration that a contract exists between the two parties during the business, and the purpose of the transboundary movement. So this you can also find information in more detail in the annexes to the guidelines where the forms are suggested. Maybe at the end we can show that to you. But there also you have to explain if in a specific case of a transboundary movement of used equipment, this is aiming at failure analysis or repair or refurbishment. This is all to protect the movement to happen in a proper way and guarantee that all the parties involved are in accordance and doing things in the way that they agreed upon. Here it's similar to the other case, so each equipment should also be individually protected to prevent damage during the transportation, and the declaration that shows that this equipment is not considered to be waste by any of the parties or countries involved in the transportation. Finally, upon receipt of the shipment, the receiving facility should provide a signed declaration of receipt. And as per the guidelines, all this documentation should be kept by the involved parties for a period of at least 1 year, in case there are issues related to the transboundary movement. In Figure 1 of the technical guidelines, it tries to illustrate some decision steps that competent authorities of different countries would have to do when they are dealing with used equipment, either for one purpose or the other. So here on the top box on the left side, the question is the used equipment defined or considered to be waste in any of the countries involved? And if you take the little elliptic yes on the right side, you immediately go to the definition that Basel applies, because you are talking about waste. So in this case, there is no question. If the used equipment is considered waste by any of the countries involved, then the PIC procedure should apply, meaning the country trying to export has to ask for permission by the transit countries and importing countries, and they have to accept so that the movement can take place. If one of them does not accept, the movement cannot take place. So taking, again, the top box and asking ourselves if the used equipment is destined or is defined or considered to be waste, and the answer is no, then we go down to the other track of decisions here, where then the competent authority would ask if the functionalities of the used equipment, for example, have been tested. And again, if the answer is no, you would have to see if you are aiming at then doing failure analysis, refurbish, or repair. And if no, again, you have a case of waste. But if you say, yes, it's for one of those purposes, so you have to see if you have all the documentations, for example, available, if the equipment is protected. So this is the track of decisions on the left side on the screen. And if all of these yes take place, documentation is in place, and the tests are met, or the purpose are defined, and all the parties involved are not considering this used equipment as waste, then the last box here on the left side says the used equipment should not be considered waste under the convention, and the transportation can take place in a normal way. So the Basel Convention wouldn't apply, because then it's not considered to be waste. Additionally, there are a few mentionings in the technical guidelines requesting parties to inform the Secretariat about their positions. One of them is if a party wishing not to allow the import or export of used electrical and electronic equipment destined for failure analysis, repair, or refurbishment, they should really notify the Secretariat so that the Secretariat can publish this information on the website of the convention, and all the parties can have that information in a handy way to help them deciding to do certain movements or not. So that's one of the requests for all the parties which are in this situation. Also, a party which is wishing to import used equipment destined for these purposes, failure analysis, repair, or refurbishment, and they have facilities that do this operation in a proper way, they also should inform the Secretariat about their options. And the Secretariat should also put this information available for other parties to consult. That could be that there are facilities that perform such operations in each country, and they can as well define which facilities could do this kind of operations, or are allowed, have the permits to do this kind of operations. So in general terms, the target groups of the technical guidelines are government agencies, including enforcement agencies that are implementing, controlling, or enforcing legislation, and also providing training to different officers involved in transboundary movements in export, import, or transit. And they are also intended to inform all actors involved in the management of electronic waste and used equipment so that they can be aware of this guidance and of the restrictions and the different scenarios when preparing or arranging import, transit, or export of such elements. So the guidelines are available on this website. The presentation is going to be shared later on with all of you, and you have access to this link, which is basically the Conference of the Parties meeting website, where you can find the documents after the decision of the last COP. And for the information that I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, if any party or stakeholder would like to send comments and suggestions on the issues listed under the decision and under the technical guideline, the person to receive these comments is Mr. Ibrahim Shafi, and here's his webmail. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll pass it on to my colleagues here from the webinar team.
Thank you, Carla, for your presentation. So now the floor is open for discussion, comments, and questions. If you have any questions, you could raise your hand and unmute yourself to speak. And you could also post your question in the chat window or the Q&A window too.
So, for example, here I would like to share with you quickly a view on the appendixes of the technical guidelines. So this one, for example, is a format suggested to accompany transboundary transport of used equipment, which fall under the paragraph 31A. So here you have information about the person who arranges the transport, the company, the distributor, and a declaration in number 4 on the screen, saying that the person who conducted the evaluation and testing declares that the results are complete and correct, meaning that the equipment is still fully functional. That's to support the situation under paragraph 31A. Then you have here more details about each of the equipment involved in the transportation. So lots of details about the year of production and the date of the functionality tests and the kind of tests which were performed to indicate that the used equipment is still functioning. While Appendix 3 is helping the situation for the scenario on the paragraph 31B for the different purposes, failure analysis, repair, and refurbishment, as we discussed before, and the rest that we discussed in the previous scenario as well. So the information about the people involved in the transport, the responsible one starting the process, and the receiving facility and the contact person on that. So there are many details here, and this is aiming at helping parties organize the information required under these different paragraphs to help them fulfill all the situations and the details to define that used equipment is not waste. So here also at the bottom you have a declaration where it says that the transportation, that the company doing this transportation is aware that all the countries involved in the transportation consider this used equipment as not waste, as we try to highlight in our presentation. So if any of the countries involved in the transportation consider this kind of used equipment as waste, then the Basel Convention PIC procedure should apply. Another thing I would like to highlight with you, for you, is some of the issues that we have in Annex 5. So Annex 4 has a lot of reference materials provided by countries, but also the group also realized that several items still require further work. So if you are invited to take a look at this appendix 5, where different positions for different areas of the guidelines which still require further elaboration and work are necessary. So here you see different things. For example, the issue of obsolete technologies such as CRT. So the party didn't have the time to finally get to a conclusion on this topic and decided that this has to be revisited in the future. Also, more details about relevant actors. The specific issue on medical devices, which has some particularities in comparison to other types of used equipment and electronic equipment in general, and so on. So these are also items that parties and other stakeholders, the members of the Small Intersessional Working Group may wish to comment and send comments to the Secretariat. No question. So there was a question from a participant about the availability of the document in other languages than English. The Secretariat is at the moment fundraising for that purpose, but we still don't know exactly when this is going to be available. So we are trying our best to get the required funding to translate all the technical guidelines that were adopted in the last COP. And there are 9 documents. And as soon as we get the possibility of funding, we will start with the translation. At the moment, we are still working on the editing process of the other guidelines, while this one has been finalized and is available already as a revised version in English. So another thing I would like to highlight for you is that the Secretary is waiting for comments to use as an input in the discussions in the open-ended working group next year. And these comments are on the items that I mentioned in one of my slides in the beginning. These comments should reach the Secretary, if possible, by the end of this year on the items under paragraph 5 of the decision. On the issues of residual lifetime, management of hazardous waste from failure analysis, etc., on obsolete technologies, and the presence of hazardous components in used equipment. So we would appreciate if some of you could let us know what the situation of your countries are regarding these topics.